Yeah, I formally would like to welcome you all, people who have made it to the meeting till now, to this special talk, and especially the speaker for this talk, Dr. Arian Hopf from University of Heidelberg, Institute of South Asian Studies. He is a lecturer for Urdu at the Institute of South Asian Studies, Heidelberg, and has spent what is of our special interest, I would say, is his PhD research, which has been on Aligarh Movement and the history of Aligarh Movement. Uh, the topic, as already mentioned in the poster, Dr. Hopf has written his PhD thesis on the topic, the dynamics of the concept of religion in colonial South Asia, and an analysis of the conceptions of religion and Islam during the 19th and 20th, early 20th century, which focused on the Aligarh movement. So from this very thesis came out the book recently, which he was very kind enough to share with us, and I did forward it to several people in the university, and they were very much, impressed by the work, and they read it, and we're very keen to, hear you one fine day in Aligarh itself. So he'll be representing some part of that research today in the talk. But before we go any further, we have among us our faculty dean, Professor Dr. Jawaid Iqbal, who will be formally introducing the speaker, and then after that we will have the talk. Yeah, but before we start that, I would like to introduce our dean a bit. He is a scholar himself of international relations, and with particular interest to West Asian studies, Middle East, and is himself has been teaching since almost more than 30 years now, in various capacities in Aligarh Muslim University. Is an author of 3 books with the focus on Palestine and Israel conflict, and has also spent several semesters in Sweden, Norway, and Austria, in different capacities for different workshops and programs. So we are very humble to have him on. Also, he was very kind and helpful to help us in organizing this whole thing. So I will now give the word to sir.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. We are indeed very lucky today to have Dr. Arian Hopf with us, who will be delivering a lecture on the Aligarh Movement. The Institute of South Asian Studies, University of Heidelberg, has done some pioneering work with regard to South Asia, and Professor Hopf is one among the scholars who have studied the region thoroughly and with lot of interest. This goes to show how important the Aligarh movement is, not only in South Asia but globally, because our alumni is spread over almost every country in the globe. Dr. Hoff has been teaching in the Institute of South Asian Studies, Heidelberg, from 2017-18, and he has a long list of publications. He has published monographs, several articles. He has done translation works and reviews. So since already we are running late, without taking much time, I would like to invite Dr. Hoff to begin his presentation. Dr. Arian Hoff, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honor for you to be here, and thank you very much for this invitation. Yeah, as you already have said, so I'm actually going to present only a part of this whole book, because otherwise it would be, of course, a too huge topic for a short presentation here. So what I try to do is to analyze a bit the Musaddas of Hali, and I chose this particular chapter, well, it's even a part of a chapter, because it reflects the most important topics that reappear all over the book. And with this having said, I will just start the presentation. One second. Okay, so I hope you can see this. Okay, the critique of South Asian religions by European missionaries as well as Orientalists, and increasingly by science in the second half of the 19th century, triggered the establishment of several religious reform movements. A very common approach to refuting European critique was the reconstruction of an unadulterated original form of the respective religion, as the colonialists viewed the present state of the respective religions as decayed in comparison to a former golden age. In this paper, I will discuss Khaja Altaf Hussain Hali and his Musaddas with respect to the aim to rediscover original Islam. I will examine how he positions his historical reconstruction of Islam in relation to the dominant discourse of science and rationalism as a marker of European influence, and in what sense Europe is perceived as an explicit or implicit telos of history. The overarching question is therefore how this positioning affects Hali's reconstruction of origin. In the following discussion, I will concisely summarize the content of his poem, and in the subsequent section, I will then present an analysis of this poem that incorporates Hayden White's theory of historiography. Under the influence of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Khaja Altaf Hussain, better known actually by his Takhallus Hali, composed his most influential work, his Maddu Jazra Islam, but this one is actually also better known, popularly known as Musaddas Hali nowadays. And it had a major impact and brought him several admirers. The Musaddas is a historical poem which, quote, contrasts the past glory of Islam with the current status of Muslims to arouse their sense of honor and shame, unquote. The dichotomy of the two concepts, taraqi or progress and tanazul, decay, is the main theme of this poem. After some introductory stanzas, Hali begins to depict the pre-Islamic period, the so-called period of ignorance, Jahiliyat also called. This area is unequivocally described as a dark chapter of the history of Arabia. And he writes, well, unfortunately, I only have the English translation here because this was used in the chapter and I hadn't the time to collect all the original Urdu parts, but I think it will still work with the translation. No shadow of civilization had fallen upon it, which is implied here, Arabia. Not even one step of progress had come there. The following stanzas proceed in listing the evils and coarseness of pre-Islamic Arabian society. Hali starts with the inhospitality of the climate of the desert, which had not been cultivated by the Arabs, and continues with likewise unplowed a state of their minds. He goes on criticizing the ubiquitous idol worship which had even occupied the Kaaba in Mecca. He then bemoans the disunity and continuous quarreling of the Arab tribes and denounces their disrespect of women while emphasizing the evils of gambling and alcohol. According to Hali, only the appearance of the Prophet Muhammad brought the Arabs out of this period of ignorance and showed them the truth of the monotheism of Islam. Hali states that Muhammad taught them essential moral and social lessons. His teaching so prevailed over habit that those who had been addicted to falsehood came to be seekers of the true God. All their vices were changed into virtues, their frames were endowed with the Spirit. The stone which the Masons had rejected came at last to be set as the head. Hali idealizes the early period of Islam as a time when the entire Muslim society lived according to the message of Muhammad and when all of the previous evils of pre-Islamic society had been abolished. When the community had received all God's bounty, when the apostleship had discharged its function, when there remained among men no arguments to advance against God, when the Prophet decided upon departure from the world, then he left behind as heirs of Islam a people which has few parallels in the world. All men were obedient to Islam, all men came to the aid of Muslims. Men were true to God and the Prophet. Men treated orphans and widows with compassion. All were disgusted with the way of unbelief and falsehood. All were drunk with the intoxicating wine of truth. The Muslim community had been perfected during the time of Muhammad to the point that during the reign of the first caliphs, Muslim society was also unparalleled. Hali herein constructs a sharp dichotomy between the pre-Islamic period and the early period of Islam. He contrasts the pre-Islamic period with the early period of Islam and describes it as a time of degradation in every way, be it with respect to social or moral conditions. On the other hand, the only period of Islam is depicted as a perfect society. Thus, only after the spread of Islam did progress appear in Arabia, upon which, quote, no shadow of civilization had fallen and where not even one step of progress had come, unquote. In the following stanzas, Hali proceeds to describe the general darkness, Am Tariki Kazamana as he calls it, which spread over the whole world, thus referring to the Dark Ages in Europe and likewise in India and Persia. At the time that the idea of progress came to them, a darkness was spread over the inhabited quarter of the world. Over every people lay the shadow of decline which had caused them all to fall from the heights. Those nations which are the stars of heaven today were all hidden in the twilight of degradation. In describing at length the ignorance and state of degradation of all civilized countries at the time of the appearance of Islam, Hali applies this idea as a contrasting point of reference for the advances of the Muslims, as he calls it. Musulmanun ki tarakkiyat. But then Hali discontinues this description of the various aspects of Muslim progress and recognizes a decay of the people of Islam, or Tanazzul Ahl Islam as he calls it. It remains uncertain as to when Hali sets the beginning of this decay. After bemoaning the Muslims' devastated state, he abruptly praises the efficiency of the Europeans, Ahl Europe ka zabte awqat, as he calls it, for example, and shows an appreciation for the prosperity and the nobility of the manners and habits of the Hindus who inhabit the same land as South Asian Muslims. Yet only the Muslims are incapable of progressing in their current state. Hali compares them to a devastated garden which, quote, in no way bears even the name of freshness, whose green sprays have been scorched and have fallen off, unquote. On the other hand, all of the other nations are compared with gardens which are already flourishing. Quote, although their plants have not put forth leaf and fruit, they do appear ready to bloom. Unquote. Here the dichotomy of decay and progress is completely reversed. This time Islam is attributed the label of decay, whereas Europeans are unequivocally identified with progress. In the remaining stanzas of his Musaddas, Hali addresses what he sees as the various reasons for the decay of Muslim society. He criticizes the aristocratic and prosperous Muslims' lack of interest in social and political affairs. Hali finds them occupied with the idle pastime of flying pigeons or addiction to opium. However, his criticism is not restricted to the elite classes, but likewise includes the general degeneration of Muslim society and its loss of the qualities and values which the Muslim Shariat teaches. According to Hali, no respect for or interest in learning remained in the Muslim community. Neither books nor real learned men and religious scholars existed. Instead, he sees those who claim to be learned as fraudsters, lacking any knowledge. Others are criticized for the dissemination of hate against both Muslims and non-Muslims. In Hali's view, these ulama brand one another as infidels and thus disunite the Muslim community. They complicate the originally simple religion of Islam and overemphasize outward aspects. The commands of the Holy Law were so agreeable that Jews and Christians were filled with love for them. The entire Quran is witness to their mildness. The Prophet himself proclaimed, religion is easy. But here they have made them so difficult that believers have come to consider them a burden. For Hali, Muslims have abolished the holy law and gone astray from the teachings of Islam. Conversely, he considers the progress of Europe to be a result of its acknowledgement of the very principles which Islam teaches. Those who act on the basis of this weighty utterance today flourish upon the face of the earth. They are superior to all, high and low. They are now the central axis of humanity. Those covenants of the holy law which we have broken have all been firmly upheld by the people of the West. But how is this progress to be understood? To answer this question, it will be necessary to concisely discuss the concept of progress and its implications for historiography. In the following section, I will discuss Hayden White's approach to historiography in order to provide a theoretical framework for my analysis of the concept of progress and the structure of a historical narrative. Progress is a concept which presupposes a linear succession of events. According to Georg Hendrik von Wright, progress inevitably requires a telos, a destination of the successive chain of events in history. Wright puts the telos in a distant future, thus implying a striving towards a distant destination. This distant destination serves as point of reference for identifying an event as progress or decay. This forms a referential axis for measuring the chain of successive events with three crucial stages: the past, the present, and the future destination of perfection. An event of the present is measured with respect to its approximation to the future telos in comparison to the past. While Wright describes the telos as a universal destination of all history, Hayden White's analysis of historiography makes this universality very questionable. In his meta-history, he describes a three-stage structure which shapes the interpretation of history. In the first instance, the elements in the historical field are organized into a chronicle by the arrangement of the events to be dealt with in temporal order of their occurrence. Then the chronicle is organized into a story by the further arrangement of the events into the components of a spectacle or process of happening, which is sought to possess a discernible beginning, middle, and end. White distinguishes a historical story from a chronicle insofar as the latter is open-ended, while the former is the extraction of a three-stage compound of event. So I've tried to make this clearer with this figure here. So at the top you see the chronicle just as a following events one after another and this open end, while the historical story extracts, so to say, the parts of the beginning, middle, and end of a historical story from the chronicle. White distinguishes a historical story from a chronicle insofar as the latter is open-ended, while the former is the extraction of a three-stage compound of events. Events, however, do not have any self-referential meaning, acquiring it only through the arrangement within a historical story. It is sometimes said that the aim of the historian is to explain the past by finding, identifying, or uncovering stories that lie buried in chronicles, and that the difference between history and fiction resides in the fact that the historian finds his stories, whereas the fiction writer invents his. This conception of the historian's task, however, obscures the extent to which invention also plays a part in the historian's operation. The same event can serve as a different kind of element of many different historical stories, depending on the role it is assigned in the specific motivic characterization of the set to which it belongs. The historian arranges the events in the chronicle into a hierarchy of significance by assigning events different functions as story elements in such a way as to disclose the formal coherence of a whole set of events, considering as a comprehensible process with a discernible beginning, middle, and end. White thus makes a clear distinction between a chronicle and a historical story. The former is a mere register of events. The events subsequently follow each other without implying any obvious mutual. The chronicle can be continued ad infinitum. The historical story, however, is always divided in a tripartite structure with the crucial parts of beginning, middle, and end. This implies the integration of some events and the omission of others in this structure, and thus assigns them a meaning within a coherent narrative that they do not possess inherently. Rather, meaning is acquired only through its integration in the tripartite structure of history. Events alone do not have any self-evident meaning. Only within the contingent framework of the historical narrative are chronicled events presented as allegedly self-evident. The introductory event is deemed to predict the subsequent events, finally resulting in the end of the story. The end of the story is presupposed as an inevitable result, which was already indicated by every event of the story. Every event is read with respect to its destination, the end of the story. Nevertheless, the mere chronicle of events does not imply this allegedly self-evident meaning. The identification of the conclusive reference point predetermines the selection of the preceding events and their organization in the tripartite structure. Thus, the beginning does not in fact predict any necessary subsequent chain of events. Rather, the conclusive point of reference affects the selection of events from the chronicle, which assumes the self-evident meaning of events. That said, none of its individual parts can claim self-evidence. Only within this tripartite structure are the elements arranged within a referential system. Neither the beginning nor the end of the story can be found in the elements themselves. The assertion of one single universal telos therefore becomes questionable, as every story establishes its own contingent telos, which fundamentally structures the perception and selection of the preceding events. Telos is a plural concept, created within the structure of every story. It cannot be reduced to a singularity, but is rather a contingent creation, differing with every story. History is merely a construct of the tripartite structure. White examines the implications of the tripartite structure, emphasizing the referential character of the end of the story. Events receive meaning only within this structure and through their reference to the end. None of the parts of this structure can have a claim for self-evidence. The beginning as well as the end of the story are contingent choice and thus may differ with every story. Likewise, the telos cannot claim any singularity, but is a decision of the historian. Foucault adds to this in his article Nietzsche Genealogy History. He exposes the limitation of the historian's viewpoint according to his present context. Past circumstances and views cannot be revived and thus are reread from the historian's present socio-cultural perspective. The parts of the historical story are hence subject to a retroactive process of projection. The present is projected onto the past. In the following discussion, I aim to apply this theoretical approach to Halis Musaddas and his presentation of the two stories of the history of Islam. I will interrogate the ways in which the rearrangement of events and the relocation of the end of the story culminate in a reinterpretation of their meaning. How is the original unadulterated Islam conceived of, and how does Hali utilize the structure of historiography to propose his interpretation? Halis Musaddas can be divided into two narratives. The first describes in a nostalgic vein the various achievements of Muslims in the early period of Islam. The telos of this first historic story is set in the early period of Islam. This restriction of the continuum to the structure of the tripartite historical story permits Hali to present Islam as a distinct break from the past, thus constructing a dichotomy between pre-Islamic and Islamic times. He, however, emphasizes that this particular expression must not be perceived as final and immutable as European critique assumes. On the contrary, the essential principles of Islamic teachings must be examined, for only those demonstrate the inherently progressive character of Islam. Hali presents a rather abstract definition of Islam, focusing on its core essence. Christopher Shackle states in his introduction that Hali attempts to, quote, disentangle a culture's self-perception from its historical involvements with worldly power, so that the kernel of its identity might become self-dependent and insulated from the revolution of political fortune, unquote. This distinction of a core essence of Islam, signified through certain overarching principles, permits the rejection of the charge of immutability, instead permitting the characterization of Islam as progressive. But the Musaddas does not end with this nostalgic glorification of a former golden age in Islam. This golden age is rather instrumentalized to disentangle the progressive essence of Islam from the overarching point of reference that is Europe. The second story, however, has to include the European telos. It reverses the preceding one and bemoans the present decay of Muslim society, thus having a clearly different referential continuum. The telos of European achievement serves as the reference point for the contemporaneous situation of Muslims. While Hali praises the Europeans, he depicts the state of Muslim society as one of devastation. Neither their wealth remained intact, I'm quoting from the Musaddas here, neither their wealth remained intact nor their prestige. Their fortune and prosperity forsook them. Sciences and arts took leave of them one by one. All their virtues were destroyed by degrees. Neither religion nor Islam was left. Only the name of Islam was left." Unquote. The protagonists of both stories, the first presenting as nostalgia for the golden age of Islam, the second its decay, are the Muslims. But in terms of White's analytical framework, they differ in the extent to which the protagonist corresponds with the telos of the story. Because the teleological reference point is identified with the protagonist, the first story culminates in a golden age narrative of progress. Thus, the telos and protagonists correspond in Hali's first historical narrative. The preceding state of pre-Islamic Arabia serves as a negative example, as it is measured on the grounds of the telos of Islam. The latter can thus be distinguished as progressive. The second story, on the contrary, begins with this golden age of Islam, but ends with the progressive state of modern Europe. Thus, the protagonists and telos diverge. Consequently, the second story reads as a story of decay, for the Muslim protagonists are measured not against their own telos, but against modern Europe. Because the telos of Europe is presupposed as the reference point for the universal conception of progress, Muslims thus face the inevitable characterization of lack. Moreover, Europe's progress is universalized, disallowing a multiplicity of possible progresses. Progress in general is equated with the particular progress of Europe. Europe and Western science are perceived as telos. And here again a quote from the Musaddas: "The results of Western science and art have been apparent in India for 100 years, but bigotry has put such blinkers on us that we cannot see the manifestation of truth. The theories of the Greeks are implanted in our hearts, but we do not believe in the revelation presently granted us. It is important to take, unquote, first of all, it is important to take his choice of words here into account. For the last stanza applies key religious terminology to Western culture. It is first significant that Hali applies the Quranic iman, belief, instead of the general term yaqeen. Furthermore, he terms the distribution of Western science as wahi, a terminus technicus otherwise restricted to the divine revelations of prophets. This wording puts Europe and European knowledge in an unequivocally religious setting and suggests that Hali literally equates the narrative structure of the two stories. The Europeans thus take up the role of the Muslims who brought progress to pre-Islamic Arabia. Therefore, in the second story, the Europeans are described as the prophets in a way of their time and Western science as their revelation. This second story emulates the structure of the first but diverges, as mentioned, with respect to its teleological reference point. Here, Hali acknowledges the Europeans and their knowledge as telos, thus putting Muslims in the position of the pre-Islamic Arabs who are in need of divine revelation. The revelation of Islam is thus equated with Western science as a modern form of revelation. The progressive position is inhabited by the inheritor of the respective telos. Consequently, this positioning is of crucial importance for the interpretation of historical events, as provided they do not inherently possess any self-evident meaning, but receive their meaning only through their positions within the tripartite structure of historical stories, with their relation to the end of the story serving as the point of reference which structures the whole story. Thus, the Golden Age of Islam receives two different interpretations. While this Golden Age signifies Islamic progress when it is equated with the telos of the first story, when placed at the beginning of the second, it becomes the starting point for the decay of Muslim society. Hali now depicts the Muslim protagonists as being detached from the telos and henceforth measured on a basis other than themselves. The second story still acknowledges the progressive character of a golden age, albeit one born in classical Greece. However, its regulations, which were perceived in the first story in comparison to the preceding period as being progressive and are perceived negatively, as exhibiting a fixation of temporary regulations and the loss of the inherent eternal principles. This shift in the teleological reference point again implies the comparison of an external conception of progress with the self-referential insufficiency. That said, progress is not a universal and self-evident concept, but necessarily requires a particular, an exemplary point of departure to be abstracted into an allegedly universal concept. At this stage of discussion, it is crucial to take Hali's distinction between Muslims and Islam into account, for this will explain the relation of the two stories in further detail. As discussed above, he emphasizes a separation of historical developments and an essence of Islam. While the Muslims of the early period of Islam acted entirely in accordance with this essence, later Muslims became incapable of discerning this essence and did not recognize the deeper meaning of religious practices. They rather insisted on an empty shell, according to Hali, and became detached from the essence of Islam. These later Muslims of the second story deemed the practices of the early period of Islam to be divinely inspired, eternal and immutable universals, thus losing touch with the overarching principles. He blames the ulama for illegitimately leading the people astray from these simple principles. Hali misses the importance of faith or iman in those discussions, however, and bemoans the fact that the actual purpose of Islam has been forgotten behind this overemphasis of outward practices, namely, quote, the refinement of morals and the perfecting of the soul. This has to be read as an attempt to construct an essence of Islamic principles which is distinct from historical developments and fixations. In Hali's view, this essence has been adopted by Europe, whereas Muslims fell prey to bigotry and conservatism, rejecting any adaptations and insisting on the unmodified preservation of early practices, thus abandoning the deeper principles of Islam. Consequently, by equating the teloi of the first and the second story, Hali identifies both as being the essence of Islam. And the second story, however, Muslims have gone astray of this telos, while the Europeans adopted it, hence having progressed. This allows Hali on the one hand to present the Europeans' dependence on Islam, as well as, on the other hand, the Muslims' ability to progress again if the essence of Islam is discerned and separated from contemporaneous bigotry. If, however, Hali equates the teloi and assumes them to be essentially the same, namely the essential principles of Islam, the question of the relationship or perhaps in the interdependence arises. Is the telos of the second story a mere adoption of essential Islam? In point of fact, Hali's description of the original Islam rather appears as a retroactive relocation of the telos of Europe to the early period of Islam, a closer examination of the proposed achievements and aspects of progress which Muslims attained in comparison to the pre-Islamic period, reveals striking resemblances to the points of critique put forward by European critics. Hali cannot evade the ubiquitous telos of modern Europe. Even the first story is interpreted with reference to this telos. For how is progress defined? Progress remains inseparably tied to the telos of the second story, which is reimagined and recognized in the original Islam. Hali's ordering of history is consequently no revivification of an origin, but rather has to be understood as a reconstruction originating in the telos of Europe. European critique thus forms the perception of original Islam. And herewith I would like to come to my conclusion. The European claim of universality has proven to be a starting point for differing Muslim reactions. A recurrent approach is the attempt to reconstruct an original Islam. It could be argued, however, that the quest for an original Islam rather proved to be a projection surface upon which to illuminate present Muslim circumstances and their demands. The dominant discourse of Europe served as the crucial point of reference against which to define original Islam. The conception of the origin has proven to be contingent. It fundamentally depends on the respective point of reference within the tripartite structure of history. Only this relative structure conveys meaning, as events within the open-ended structure of chronology do not inherit any meaning per se. Any meaning is given merely through integrating a selection of events within the limited structure of a historical story or narrative, the beginning of which is then perceived as pointing inherently to the story's conclusion. Hali's Musaddas is in itself a perfect example of this dependency on referential definition. He describes two stories depicting the golden age of Islam in differing contexts. The first story identifies the early period of Islam as the telos, comparing it to the preceding time of the pre-Islamic Arabia. Thus, early Islam can be presented as inherently progressive. This very period is perceived in the second story as the beginning of the story, which is then compared to the alien telos of Europe. The regulations of the early period presented in the first story as progressive remain unchanged in this second story and come to be perceived as immutable and divine. According to Hali, the intentions and inherent principles of the early Muslims are no longer comprehended by later Muslims. Thus, Hali criticizes them as backward in view of the telos of Europe. This entire argument is fundamentally based on the referential character of historiography, which allows one to depict even the same period with contradictory meanings. The valuation of the origin depends heavily on its referential telos. It could furthermore be shown that the origin is rather a construction which reflects and recognizes the present and the past. Hali's presentation of the dual story of the Musaddas aims first and foremost to reject the European critique of Islam by depicting an original Islam that is entirely in conformity with the demands of a universalized European concept of religion, starting point from which his own critique originates. But only on second sight one recognizes the subversive character of this dependency of the European telos and the golden age of Islam. For Hali inscribes an Islamic character into European progress, as Europe progressed only after adopting the essence of Islam. Hence Europe's progress is fundamentally based on the essence of Islam. And what is more, Europe's claim to be the sole inheritor of progress and its claim for universality is undermined. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Hopf. I would like to go ask for any questions if there are any. I mean, I know it might take some time, but I myself wanted to have a question first. I mean, but yeah, I mean, you're open to interject anytime and raise a question if you have any. I would go first. It's a question in regard to the general idea of what you have done in your work, and the idea of progress and modernity are always looked into kind of interchangeably, right? I mean, these are concepts which are looked at as somewhat, synonymous to each other in some way. Do these people like Hali and Sir Syed and others in the movement also are having any ideas about how this progress, quote unquote, is achieved, and do they have any idea of any relationship to this progress with colonization of the South Asian region by the European powers? And do they see any relationship between these two things, progress on the one hand and colonization on the other? Yeah, so is it just the way you talked about the tripartite system of the telos-oriented approach towards progress? Is that the only thing they are looking at, or you also see this connection between the material, base for this progress, which was achieved by Europe, or they see it totally as a cultural phenomenon?
Okay, thank you for this question. I think it were many questions in one, but let me try to answer, and you can ask afterwards if I haven't answered all questions. But first of all, well, you said that progress and modernity seem to be used synonymously. Well, from the text that I have read with Hali and Syed Ahmad Khan, I've read most of the texts that I've used in my book were by Syed Ahmad Khan, but I also try to include other authors, of course. So Nazir Ahmad, Shibli Nomani, etc. But I think the term modernity didn't even appear. As far as I remember, I haven't seen this term, but it was always the question of progress. And progress is, of course, related. There is a connection, of course, to Europe and the colonial situation. Yeah, well, we have to keep in mind the colonial situation with this, inequality of power, that there is, so to say, what I try to describe with this European discourse, dominant discourse of European, Western science, European science, etc. And we also have to see, the context of the missionaries and science in general. These are in a way dominant discourses that these people were in a way compelled to answer to. they were criticized by Orientalists that started working on Islam, started to compare Islam with Christianity in the first instance. Yeah, that happens firstly in the context with the missionaries, but then also in the context of Muir, for example, William Muir, yeah, who has written this famous book that also Syed Ahmad Khan answers to in a way. So they are starting comparing other religions and Islam being just one of them with Christianity. So Christianity is like taken as the abstract telos of history in a way. Yeah, the universality is related with Christianity, and then later on in the late 19th century it shifts rather from Christianity towards science as the marker of this progress and modernity. And of course, with this critique from the colonialist side, people were of course compelled to answer to it. And even if they just answered in the negative, I also have seen many answers in this way, that we don't care about this kind of critique, and it's completely untrue. Even at the moment when reformers had to answer or to respond to this critique, you have to translate in a way your answer in such a way that it fits to this dominant discourse of which I called, yeah, broadly the dominant discourse of Europe. I'm not sure if this answers your question to some extent.
I mean, maybe I can just come back with that maybe the earlier question, the first question about synonymous
Mhm.
ideas of modernity and progress. That was also in regard to Faisal Devji's article of the apologetic modernity. When he worked on the idea of modernity as it appears in Sir Sayyid's notion of progress for the Muslim community, and
Mhm.
there it is almost like a derivative idea, coming from European idea of modernity. And also in that sense, it is more of a cultural thing, that it is about, it's kind of like an idea which you have to achieve, a goal which Muslim community in South Asia
Yeah.
must aim for. But the political background of modernity as it appeared in Europe is not at all taken into consideration. The whole history of French Revolution and the way the whole Enlightenment discourse, and the whole the genealogy of it, as it were, is not really seen. It is more, as you also mentioned in your presentation, from the perspective of the present, that you look back at the past, right? So
Mhm.
that genealogy is somewhat
Okay.
not looked at so clearly.
Yeah, yeah, but for this we have to keep in mind with, well, if we look at Eastern South Asia, yeah, Bengal, nowadays Western Bengal, they of course were much earlier confronted with the colonial power, which is not the case in northern India, Delhi and all these regions. And we see this also in people like Syed Ahmad Khan and Hali. They are not that much acquainted with, yeah, with Western education, with the history of Europe, and what they saw as modernity are, of course, well, they have seen the trains, etc. Yeah, they have seen some progress in a way with the science, perhaps, yeah, to some extent, medicine, etc. Yeah, so of course that's the visible things, the cultural things, as you call it. Yeah, the visible things. That's what they could value in a way the modernity. And I think this might be different in other regions of South Asia at that time, but at least with those people, the first generation that really starts to or is compelled to respond to this colonial confrontation has a completely other background. They are rather, yeah, well, their educational background is rather traditional. Yeah, they have been brought up with Persian, Arabic, etc. And if you look at Hali, he was the first time in Lahore confronted when he was lecturing translations from English into Urdu with some ideas of modernity. And well, this was rather in his context of the Muqaddimah and in his literary reform. But I think it's the same context also in his religious ideas. So that he was actually yeah, confronted only with European, English, British ideas of modernity through translation. Yeah, and he didn't know much English. Also said Ahmad Khan also only learned a bit of English. I don't know how much he was in the end really able to handle this language. So you see the educational background is of course rather a traditional one.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So other questions, comments?
Hi, Arian. Hi, Salman.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Arian. I'm Subair, colleague of Salman. I'm very happy to hear your talk. It was very enlightening to me, actually. I was also excited to see your work written on Aligarh Movement from Europe. It was very exciting. And I was a keen attender of your talk also now. And I observed that it is not actually a question. I want to make some observations and comments I noticed. Actually, yeah, essence of Islam, as you mentioned, was lacked by in the course of time. We lacked the essence of Islam, and this is where we started to decline. So that was, but actually, this point was always there in the discussions, and also there was now we can observe two streams. One is institutionalized ulama controlled Islam, and also there is undercurrent. Actually, recently I observed a phenomena called, or a movement. You might have seen Maqasidu Sharia is there. I don't know, Arian, you have heard it or not. So there was one movement coming up among Islamic, genuine Islamic scholars who are telling that these institutionalized versions we can even set aside, and we can consider the core or essence of Islam and redefine our rules and our things. So they call it Maqasidu Sharia. The word itself means, Maqsad means the purpose. Maqasidu Sharia, the actual purpose, the essential purpose of Sharia, Islamic Sharia. So now in a parallel redefining is happening in some parts of Islamic world. It may surpass this institutionalized ulama controlled system. And also this accusations raised by Hali in his poetry Musaddas is also we can see in the works of all Sufi writers, in even it be Rumi or Hafiz. Actually, I was reading Hafiz, so he was a stringent opposer of this religious ulamas and all. So, and as a question, this was my observation and my comment I want to share. And my question would be, what actually that word Musaddas means? Is it I think in Arabic we have the origin word Sadda. Sadda means to close. Whether it comes from that origin or something else, if you can enlighten us, that would be great.
Yeah, Musaddas is actually just the rhyming scheme or the pattern, the structure, so to say. Yeah? So a stanza consists of 6, I don't know, verses, I think you call it in English. Yeah, and that's the
Misra, I think it's called.
Yeah, Misra is, I think, in the Ghazal context. I'm not sure if you call this also for the Musaddas, but anyway, it consists of at least 6 parts, and as far as I know, it's from Arabic, but it means 6. Yeah, so divided into 6 parts or so. That's the relation to it.
Just
But
like Rubaiyat, 4 stanzas.
Exactly.
Just like that, or 6 lines.
Exactly. Yeah, you also have Muhammas and things like this. Yeah, that's for 5
stanzas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's just about the rhyming scheme in a way. Yeah, but coming back to your point of the essence of Islam, that's actually a really interesting topic, and it also reappears in the book. Here I could only touch on the surface of it, and yeah, but actually this is, in Hali you have this to some extent, but in particular in Presided Ahmad Khan, this is a big topic where he in his later writings focuses exactly on this topic and tries to well, he doesn't really define what he understands as the essence of Islam, but he says there is an essence of Islam, and the way we have to understand Islam, yeah, the the rules, so to say, the Shariat, is something that has to change according to time. And the way we understand it nowadays, so in the 19th century, at his point, doesn't mean that this is the last and immutable way we should understand it, but it could go on after that, and it will keep going on. It will be progressing. And that's something that you find also nowadays in many discussions, actually. You will find this in many also rather conservative discourses. That's the interesting point. But in the 19th century, this was something quite new, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Arian.
Thank you also.
Yeah, any other? Yeah, Murad, please go ahead.
First of all, congratulations to Salman, our dear colleague, and also to Arian for this wonderful lecture, this presentation. Though I would certainly apologize for not being so attentive, but certainly that the topic itself seems to be very useful. Maybe we could also, if this videography has been done, it has been recorded, I will again go back and ask some questions related to the same. But I think such kind of topics should be taken up more frequently. And lecturers like Arian should have been invited also in the physical mode so that the students could be greatly benefited from the knowledge that he has acquired with his personal experience as well as the theoretical understanding of his studies and research. I would also congratulate and thanks to our Dean Sir, who has always supported and encouraged us to organize such kind of activities. So this is all, Salman, I wanted to just say, but it would have been certainly very interesting to have listened to, because we are engaged into lots of duties and works and all. So that is why.
Now I'll share the book with you, which I have, the PDF.
Yes,
so
yes.
You can always come back to the topic.
Great. I would again also read the parts that you give me, and also, if possible, listen to what he has spoken about the topic. And also, the attempt was very a great attempt today to have to try to organize it with the Department of History. That would have also benefited, but because of some inevitable reasons, we couldn't do it
certain very
today.
weird,
But in future, Salman, I guess we could also take Arian's help as far as elaboration.
Surely, I mean,
on this
it is still due. I mean, he has to come and visit Aligarh once after, you were there earlier, I think in 16.
Yeah, I was.
Research.
In 2016, I was, yeah.
So you have to come back, and then perhaps some more kind of engagement or, exchange of ideas.
It's hard to find a scholar like him, I mean, who has done such kind of comparative research. So we must keep him in loop also for future activities that we may organize. Thank you, Salman.
Thank you, and I would love to come to Aligarh once again.
Let's hope that it happens sooner than expected.
Yeah.
Any other question or remark?
Hello.
Yeah, Rahman, please go
Yes,
ahead.
good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for delivering a lecture on this topic. I went through, I was listening to your presentation, and I saw this part that Hali, like in his second tripartite the portion, that Hali, he was like kind of blaming that Europeans took the real Islamic values and adopted them in their life. So that's how they progressed. So the same version, if we see that there were two like Altaf Hussain Hali and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So if we see the position of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he was quite open to adopt. So that's why he founded like a scientific society for the translation of European knowledges, as you also mentioned, that he was quite open to embrace the European model of progress or modernity, as you say. So I just wanted to know what was the position of Hali regarding the progress. Was he for taking the European ideas, or he was kind of finding his own progress in his own culture and his own civilization. If
Yeah,
the
thank you for,
position of Hali.
yeah, thank you for this comment, for this question. Well, in the religious context, I would say he goes more or less along with Syed Ahmad Khan, and uh, yeah, well, he is quite open also to these things, but I think he is nowadays rather known for his poetic and literary reforms if we compare these two aspects in his life. And I think in this literary aspect, I will come to this later, there the situation seems to be a bit different. But if you look at this one particular stanza that was quite interesting, wherein he describes in a way the Europeans, or well, at least uses, I'm not sure if he would call them prophets, that would be too much of course, but at least he uses a terminology that is quite strange in this context for the Europeans, if you remember. So he uses the term Iman and Wahi, like revelation. And that was quite interesting for me. But what is interesting is we have to keep in mind it was shortly after the mutiny of 1857. So people, of course, in particular the Muslims and Syed Ahmad Khan, try to present and try to present the Muslims as loyal subjects of the British colonizers. They wanted to save their own position in the first instance in presenting or in rejecting the critique that this Barawat, as it was also called, was just the responsibility of Muslims. And they, in the first instance, wanted to be to show their loyalty to the British. And this is, I think, an important point that we find in many parts of Syed Ahmad Khan and also in many parts of the Musaddas. But this one thing, this one comment in which he describes actually the European progress in a way as the adoption of the Islamic essence it's not that prominent actually, but it's a quite subversive kind of statement that he makes here. Because at this point he says, well, what you Europeans achieved is actually only because of our essence, because of the essence of Islam. And we, if we once again adopt this, we will be able to progress the same way or even further than you. And here you see it's quite a subversive thing, but most people wouldn't even notice it. But if we come to the literary aspects, to the reform of his literature in which he proposes a natural, that's the term that he uses. Also in Urdu he speaks of natural or naturi shairi or poetry. Well, there it seems that he is to some extent compelled, forced to adopt some new ideas that were present at that time in Europe. Like reference to nature, to more realistic topics, etc. But on the other hand, we find him to write biographies of Ghalib, and of Sadi, etc., of many other traditional poets, while he, on the other hand, actually describes the traditional poetry or the traditional literature that you find in Persian and in Urdu at that time in the 19th century as completely irrelevant to his times. So there seems to be like an ambiguity in him, and he seems to be compelled to adopt as some new points in this regard of the natural, naturey, shairi or literature. But on the other hand, he tries also to save as much as possible of this traditional background, of the traditional literature. So there's something of an ambiguity. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I think we can take one last question by anyone and then we can proceed to the conclusion, if there is any. Well, in that case, I would request Zubair to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Salman, and thank you for getting this honor to give vote of thanks for this great program, great talk. So first of all, let me convey my heartfelt gratitude and thanks to Arian Hopf for being available here and giving a thought-provoking and very inciting speech. Actually, your talk was very limited, and actually, if you will say, it will be less than 1% of what you had written in your book. I had the honor of going through your book. Actually, it is very interesting to go through and see your observations, and also the theoretical framework you were speaking about towards the second part of your talk. Telos and all are very exciting, and we would we are very impatiently waiting to you have here in a physical mode and to hear you from the. Okay, and let me thank on behalf of our department and for the organizer, Salman sir and all, let me thank you for giving such a nice presentation and speech. And secondly, let me convey my gratitude and thanks to Chairperson and Dean of our Faculty of International, Jawaid Iqbal sir, for his opening remark, and for next let me thank Salman Abbas for his all effort. Actually it takes effort, time and everything to organize such a talk, and for his effort let God give him blessings and all for in his careers, and for all those who had raised questions, Murad and Rahman and all other participants. Thank you very much for being here, and looking forward to next.
I think, yeah, that was emotion. A lot of emotions were too much, yeah. I think your voice went away in that. You can repeat the last part of your vote of thanks.
So it was not clear.
The last sentence, I think, was just slipped away.
Okay.
Cut off, yeah.
So, okay, then I think we can conclude our session here. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you also very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it was really a pleasure and an honor for me. And I'm hoping that I will visit Aligarh really soon.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so with that, I think we can conclude today's session, and thanks for all to come to the lecture, to have participated in it, and thanks to the speaker again. Thanks a lot, Arian Hopf.
Thank you all. Thank you, Arian. Thank you so much.
Thank you.